This is one of the more complicated topics I've covered. And so this talk is based in part on some research that we are initiating here at the Ag Center and another site related to forest moths and how they might be affected by our forest management practices. So here's a brief outline of what I'm going to cover today. First off, forest management and some of the ecological considerations that go along with that. Why are we interested in moths? Some moths that we find of interest, moth sampling and observing. I'll go into a little bit of detail on the research project and then discuss a few ways how you can have fun observing, sharing, and reporting on moths yourselves. So I guess to start it off, some of you may know this or not, but just thought I'd cover a little bit about why we manage forests and the different techniques that we might use to manage a forest. And so this picture here shows the different sections of our demonstration forest here at Dixon Springs Ag Center. So each one of these areas shows a different management practice or the control section. And in general, we're manipulating the tree species dominance and vegetation in general when we do management. And in management, when we're speaking about management, in most cases, we're talking about prescribed fire, tree thinning in the understory, invasive species control, and possibly also timber harvest. So in this image here, we have the control section here in the top left, the thin only on the top right, and then a burned only section in the bottom left, and then the thin and burned section on the bottom right. And you can see visually the differences in the vegetation based on the management actions we've taken in those stands. So in a lot of cases, we are trying to manage for oak specifically. So oak species need more sunlight generally than most other of our deciduous trees in this region. So we're oftentimes using tree thinning, harvest, and fire to open up the canopy so that oaks can regenerate in the understory. This also has the other benefit of producing wildlife habitat that might be different from the majority of habitat available elsewhere. It tends to also increase herb diversity, which is oftentimes good for our pollinators because they have a greater variety of host plants and sources for pollen and nectar as well. And then on the larger scale, if you think about it in landscape terms, this management action creates more of a habitat mosaic. And so with the greater diversity of habitats, it essentially leads to greater opportunities for diversity in general. So that's sort of the big picture. So with that in mind, why are we interested in looking at moths and how forest management might affect moths? So moths, if you're not aware, are incredibly diverse. So we have this little table here in the top right that shows the number of butterflies versus the number of moths. In Illinois, there are 150 approximately butterflies, whereas there are 1,850 different moths. And so on up the line, globally, you have 17,500 butterflies and 160,000 moths. So they're incredibly diverse and they use a wide range of resources, so they can be good indicators of what can be happening on the landscape in general. They also serve as important pollinators, which, we give a lot of credit to bees and butterflies, but moths actually do a significant amount of pollinating as well. They're a critical food source for species of concern, especially birds and bats, as we'll look at in a couple of other slides here. Some can be significant pests of both forests and agricultural areas. And recently, we've had reports of significant declines in insects in general, globally. And so we're concerned about that loss and what the impact might be on their predators, those birds and bats that are also of conservation concern. So knowing more about how our actions are affecting moths will help us to improve forest management recommendations. And plus, they're just fascinating. The more I've been learning, the more I find that you could go down some pretty wild rabbit holes, and we'll take a look at some of those interesting facets of moths here in this talk. So just as some highlights here, they're also in the headlines a lot lately. They're gaining popularity both in the scientific community and in popular literature as well. For some of those reasons we already talked about, pollination, possible problems with insect declines more broadly in the world, the need for sort of helping moths as pollinators and as food sources for those animals of conservation concern. Also, we have some invasive moths. So the spongy moth there is mentioned in one of the articles, and that can be a problem for our forests as well. And then one of the more interesting articles I found was that one in the bottom right, the odd phenomenon of moth-eating bears and the dangers they face. So I encourage you to look that up in your own time at some point. It's pretty wild. So just to get in a little greater detail, so the significance of moths to bats and night-feeding birds like the nightjars, especially the whippoorwills, chuckwill's widow, and common nighthawks in our area. 60% of the diet of red bats have been found to be moths. Moths are the most frequent prey items in studies that looked at several bats. 60 to 90% of the biomass in some nightjars was found to be moths. And then, so the importance to these predators to us could be the pest control services that they provide for us in both forests and in agricultural settings. And some of you may have seen the presentation that Dr. O'Keefe did earlier in this webinar series in regard to some of that. And I encourage you to check that out on our YouTube page if you haven't seen it, but that's on bats and their ability to reduce insect density and defoliation in our forests. So really interesting research there. So let's see. So there are a couple of differences in the way these predators go after moths, and it's kind of interesting. It's almost a niche partitioning in a way. Bats are more likely to be more active on evenings when there's less moonlight available, whereas the nighthawks or nightjars are more active on nights when there's greater moonlight because they're more reliant on their vision, whereas bats are more frequently using echolocation. So it's kind of an interesting little difference there. In terms of moths versus bats, this is one of those rabbit holes I was talking about. You could go down, there's been a ton of research on the evolution and adaptations of both moths and bats and their epic struggle over time. So bats as we probably mostly know, use echolocation or sound waves to locate their prey in the dark. But they can also use sounds and smells, even from some of their prey items that might be in leaf litter, for example. And some of their defense or their counter ways to counter some of the moth adaptations is that they can reduce the volume of their echolocation as they near their prey, which is pretty interesting. And so the moths, in reaction to or in sequence with, have developed exceptional hearing in a couple of different ways. Some species also have those really long tails to deflect sound waves, but then also confuse the bats as they're approaching. And some species of moths they're finding too put off these ultrasonic clicks. And they found that some species, they do that to warn of their distaste, but then also others do it in a way that disrupts bats' echolocation. So lots of interesting avenues there in the epic struggle there between moths and bats. So not to be outdone, day active birds need moths too. So we're not just talking about the adult moths here, we're talking also about the caterpillars as well. And so there was an interesting study that Doug Talamay and others did following chickadees, and they found they required 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars per clutch. And similar findings have been found for other songbirds as well. So huge amounts of moths are needed for all those predators. So with that, we're going to kind of jump into a different section, just kind of look at some of the moth species and different families of interest. So with 1,800 or so species in Illinois, we're not going to get to them all, obviously, and we're not even going to get to all the families. But we're going to highlight a few of the more interesting ones because they're fun. So the Saturnidae, or the silkworm moth family. So this family has about 75 species, and this family includes some of the largest and most colorful of our moths, and probably most of you all's favorite ones that you mentioned in the chat if you did so earlier. And I'm going to try to also highlight the host plants of these moths that we're covering, so you have an idea. Most of these that we'll cover are somewhat adaptable and can use multiple different species. There are a few specialist ones out there, but so for this regal moth, also known as the hickory horned devil, as its larval stage there, can feed on numerous deciduous trees, including ash, beech, maple, oak, willow, and so on. Another one of our largest moth species is the Polyphemus moth. In the same family, can have up to a 6-inch wingspan, and as the name implies, can have 50 or more different host plants, including oak, ash, maple, dogwood, hickory, and willow. And then several of you mentioned the Luna moth as your favorite, and it's up there for me as well. One of the interesting things I learned about this is that the tails on the Luna moth and some other species actually also help to confuse and disrupt bat echolocation. So that was sort of an interesting adaptation. These can also have a very large wingspan of up to 4.5 inches. And they're named for their moon-like spots. This one, there are some extra spots there on the hind wing that are kind of covered up by its forewing there. And in terms of the host plant for the Luna moth, they prefer hickory and walnut, but will use other trees as well, sumacs, persimmon, sweet gum, among others. Another group of moths that are quite large are the Sphingidae or Sphinx moth family, also known as the hawk moths. And there are over 120 species in this family in the US and Canada. And this group is interesting because, well, for lots of reasons, but partly because it has species that are specialist pollinators for rare plants, including endangered orchids, but then also has some species that are considered pest species, such as the tomato hornworm and its adult stage being the five-spotted hawk moth. So the host plants for these are quite varied because we're talking about the whole family in that case, but then each of these images we have the hosts mentioned as well. So a lot of times these are going to be our deciduous trees again: ash, oak, hawthorn, walnut, butternut, hickory. It's just another look at a different looking walnut sphinx. So up next we have the Erebidae family, and this is a larger group in terms of numbers, over 900 species in the US and Canada. And this also includes some colorful ones and interesting looking species like the tiger moths and underwings, owlets and tussock moths as well. This group was formerly part of the Noctuidae family. Only mention that because it might come up if you're looking up these species, but even still with that separation, both of those groups are some of the largest moth families that we have. So the host plants for this group includes herbaceous species mostly, like milkweed, sedges, and grasses, but also deciduous trees and shrubs, and even pines for some species. We have the white-marked tussock moth there in the top right, looking quite hairy and with the feathery antenna, and feeds on many different tree species, deciduous and evergreen. Whereas the Anna tiger moth feeds on many different herbaceous plants. Here's a few more from that family. Kind of some interesting looks. The painted lichen moth, interestingly, feeds on lichens as a caterpillar. The delicate Cisnea feeds on dogbane. So this is kind of similar to how monarchs feed on milkweeds, and they pick up the toxins from the plant. And then that deters predators from eating them as adults. And then the Virginian tiger moth, one of our most common moths. Host plants are various herbs and deciduous woody species as well. Okay, up next we have the Noctuidae family. So this is a very diverse family with over 2,500 species in the US and Canada. Includes the loopers and daggers, among others. This group also contains some significant agricultural pests. I have a couple of them pictured here: the black cutworm and the fall armyworm. So both of those are significant pests of our crops and vegetables. As a group, because there's so many, the host plants are going to vary significantly among species. So let's see. Some more from the Noctuidae family. These are not considered pests necessarily, just some more interesting ones that we've seen. The black-bordered lemon moth. The hosts are crabgrass and morning glories. The wedgeling. Their host plant is mainly wood sorrel. and the three-line flower moths with their hosts, the bonesets and Joe Pye weeds and blazing stars. So all three of these are using more herbaceous plants versus most of the other moths we've seen so far feeding more on the woody plant species. Up next, we have another very large family, the Geometridae, or the inchworm family. So this one has over 1,400 species in the US and Canada and feeds on many different deciduous trees. Couple highlights here, the tulip tree beauty, which as the name implies, uses tulip trees as one of its main hosts, but also pawpaw and sassafras. Then the curved-toothed geometer, with hosts being the ash, birch, elm, basswood, maple, willow, and several others. This one I did not get down to species, Iridopsis species, also in the geometer family. This is a pretty neat caterpillar. If you haven't seen these before, this is the camouflage looper. And its adult form, it's known as the wavy-lined emerald. But if you didn't pick it out, it's actually right here. And these caterpillars will pick off little bits of the plant they're on and attach them to themselves. So that's a pretty awesome form of camouflage. Up next, we have the Notodontidae, or prominent moth family. This is kind of a smaller number of species in this family in our area, with 140. But this is a group that typically prefers woodlands and especially oaks, willows, poplars, and so on. One of the stranger looking moths, well, actually, this is a whole family, Pterophoridae. I'm not sure if I pronounced that one correctly, but this is the plume moth family. If you've seen one of these, you may not think you're looking at a moth. Look more like possibly a fly or something. But there's 150 different species in the US and Canada. And we don't know a whole lot about the host plants for some of the species in this family, but the ones we do know about are largely herbaceous plants such as yarrow, boneset, morning glory, and others. And at least one is a pest of greenhouses, the geranium plume moth. So with that, we're gonna kind of jump from some of the more interesting families and species and look now at the research that we are just getting into here on this in this study. So just to explain it a little deeper, so I mentioned earlier the different forest management actions that we might take. And so for this study, we're going to be placing 2 traps in each of 4 different management units at 2 different sites. And we're going to capture moths on a few nights during a couple different periods throughout the growing season, and then make comparisons of the moths that we find in the traps in the different management units. So the 2 sites are going to be here at the Dixon Springs Ag Center, and then also on the west side of the Shawnee region at the Trail of Tears State Forest. So 16 traps total, and we're going to put them in the thin only, thin and burn only, and control sections. And you can see here the trap design. They're basically a black light, which more moths are attracted to the black light than light of the visible spectrum. So basically, the moths are attracted to the light. It's powered by a little motorcycle battery, and they hit a plexiglass fan, and then they fall down into a funnel and then into the bucket, and they're captured. So in terms of the study sites, we have Trail of Tears State Forest on the west side, which is around 5,000 acres, and it's managed for multiple use, including timber, wildlife, ecosystem preservation, watershed protection, and recreation. And so this forest was only recently begun to be managed in terms of some of those practices I already discussed. So going back a few years now, they had started with some timber harvest, also some tree thinning, and prescribed burning in different units. So we're going to be looking at those different units there. And then also the demonstration forest here at the Dixon Springs Ag Center. So the sites are quite different. Dixon Springs Ag Center is also around 5,000 acres, but only around 580 of those are owned by the university. The rest are leased from the Forest Service. And then the demonstration forest here is only about 26 acres. Excuse me. With each of those with around 5 acres or 6 acres of each of those management practices. Again, the same practices in each. So we did a pilot project last year, and we made some modifications. Let me backtrack here. We made some modifications to our trap design and how we were going to execute. We found the funnels weren't quite sitting right, and so we added a piece of hose to the top of the bucket so that it fit more snugly. And then we're also having issues with the traps getting knocked over. We think possibly due to predators coming after the moths. So we decided, similar to some other studies, that we would elevate the traps. And so we're going to start this year with hanging the traps up in the tree about 2 meters off the ground. And that might actually help with being more visible to the moths as well. So in terms of kind of what we know from the literature, there have been some studies in areas looking at similar questions in terms of how forest management actions might affect moths. And so it's complicated, as you might imagine. There's so many different species of moths, as we've illustrated, so they each have somewhat different needs from their habitats. There are also many, many rare moth species, and so looking at a community like that that's so large can make generalization quite difficult. And then there are so many different factors that could contribute to differences in moth communities. It could be hard to really pin down what the main influence could be in the differences in moth communities. In large part, we know that it's due to changes in vegetation following management, which is kind of the intention of forest management to begin with, right? So in terms of how that influences moth communities, the age of the stand of a forest stand can be significant. So we would make sure for sure that we wouldn't want to eliminate all of our older stands or old growth stands, because those are going to harbor different species than younger stands. The shrub community composition can have a significant role in terms of what's there prior to management, but also following management. You could have certain species kind of explode with that burst of sunlight that they could get after a timber harvest, for example. And then, of course, you'll have the subsequent changes in what the moths might have in terms of their food availability. And then also the surrounding matrix is likely a significant factor. So if we're looking at a forest stand that has some management done, on a certain number of acres, but surrounding that forest stand might be a forest that has not had management done. So moths that might have been in that area could easily repopulate, in theory, from adjacent stands if they were to be negatively impacted by management in one stand. Whereas if you had just an isolated stand in the middle of a cornfield, and that stand had significant management done, that could have a greater influence on the overall community of moths than if you had a matrix that was more like the forest stand to begin with. So in general, older stands support greater species richness in moths, is what we know from the literature. But the tree species that dominate the canopy are also a significant factor in moth community differences. We also know that oak species support the greatest diversity of Lepidoptera caterpillars, both butterflies and moths. So the scale and the timing of forest management can make a difference. And also differences between the scale of the study. Are you looking at a landscape versus a site versus a stand, and so on? Also the time since the management practice occurred. So it's been a few years now since some of the management has occurred at both Trail of Tears and here at the Ag Center. How is that vegetation going to change over time? And then also, how is the moth community going to subsequently change over a greater number of years as well? So it might be that, initially you could have a significant change, maybe that first year or two, and then 4 or 5 years down the road, it might look quite different. And then another decade or more could look quite different again as well. So long-term research is significant and should be carried out so that we don't jump to conclusions looking at sort of early stage differences. So that's sort of an overview of our project. We are really just getting started with that. I'm really hoping to get some hard data and probably report again on that next year with some good information about what we're finding. In the meantime, though, I did want to present to you all some resources and different things that you can do to help moths out and to contribute. So you can attract moths for you to observe. And if you haven't checked it out, there's plenty of online resources, but a couple of the main ways that folks like to observe moths are to project a light onto a sheet. That way the moths are attracted to the light, they come up, they land on the sheet, they're pretty easy to observe that way. In terms of the type of light, I mentioned the black light will attract a greater number and diversity of moths in general. So if you have a black light, that's great. Other light sources that might have a greater light spectrum. Historically, researchers often used mercury vapor lights because they had a wider spectrum of light and attracted greater numbers of moths as well. But look, nowadays we have LEDs, and you can even find, regular screw-in black light bulbs that could be used as well. You can easily build one of these traps. There's a lot of different instructionals online for that as well, but it's basically a bucket, a funnel, and a couple of fans, the bucket top, and a light. There's lots of different ways you can construct them. Another interesting thing I learned that I was not aware of is that you can actually sugar for moths. So some moths are not attracted to light, but they might be attracted to a free lunch. And again, there's various recipes online, but typically these are combinations of a sugary substance of some type, a fruit, and a fermented beverage. And then the concoction is then either dipped in a rope and hung from a tree, or smeared on the side of a tree. And you can observe what comes to this concoction overnight. So I honestly have not tried this yet. We just tried it last night, and I wasn't able to monitor it overnight, so I'm still learning. But if anybody has any suggestions for that, I'd be curious if anybody's done that before. In terms of timing and other tips, so the greatest diversity of moths are going to be flying around July, but some can be active practically year round, especially here in the southern part of the state. The first thing I do every morning, we have a little light right outside of our office here that's on all night, and I'm always checking for moths. And it's interesting. Well, we found them in January, certain species. But generally, if the temperature is above 40 degrees, it's better. 60 degrees would be better than 40. You don't want to have precipitation. They're likely not going to be flying. A light or no wind is preferable. I have seen reports that humidity can be a factor, but I've seen reports either way. Some folks saying that higher humidity is better, and others finding that lower humidity is better. So not sure if that makes much difference or not. If you get interested in this, there are a few websites for reporting and for assistance with identification. Many of these species can be really difficult to tell apart. And a lot of times you might get it to the family, and that might be all you can do unless you enlist some of these professionals. There are even some species that can't be identified unless you dissect them. So wouldn't need to go there. But anyway, some of these websites are really great for both reporting and helping scientists out, like iNaturalist. But also Bug Guide and Butterflies and Moths of North America are all resources that I've used for help with identifications and for reporting them in general. So just to summarize, so moths are near the base of the food web and need native vegetation, especially oaks. Birds and bats need literally tons of caterpillars. And this is an opportunity to support wildlife by using native trees and plants in your space. So not to forget urban forests, yards, and moths. And I really appreciate this quote from a book that just came out from a co-author. Our yards are an opportunity for us to increase moths' odds of survival by choosing to grow the native plants they have adapted to eating. And so I just would encourage everyone to use native plants in your area, whether that's your yard, or if you could encourage a park district to use native species. I think that would be awesome. And then also, I did want to mention National Moth Week. So This is a its own kind of nonprofit effort to get people to appreciate moths and to go out and seek them out. You can see here they celebrate the beauty, life, and habitats of moths. Mothers of all ages and abilities are encouraged to learn about, observe, and document moths in their backyards, parks, and neighborhoods. So it's a pretty cool thing. And we are going to be hosting an event here at the Ag Center for Moth Week, Moths of the Forest, an evening of observation, Tuesday, July 25th. The details have not totally been worked out, but look for that announcement coming up. And then there's actually going to be a whole series of events planned by different extension folks down here in Southern Illinois as well. And here are some of the references. I'd also like to thank the Illinois Forestry Development Council for supporting a portion of this project. And I encourage you all, again, to check out the Illinois Extension Forestry YouTube page, both for this presentation recording in a little while and some of the others as well. That I would take any questions.